Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Anthropology 415-515. It is the 25th of September. It is Wednesday of week 6. Let's take a look at the syllabus. We're down here in field notes. We're going to talk about the some more kinds of field notes, and I actually brought you printouts for those of you in class if you want to check these out. These are the same as so you can pass these out. Yeah. These are the field notes from that are on Canvas. These are just excerpts from my 2014 November. So you can follow along. Those of you who are in internet land, I put this in the Canvas module, so you can check it out as well. We're going to be talking about field notes, talk about some of the other kinds of field notes today. We'll also talk a little bit about coding your field notes. And we will talk about homework a little bit. This is again kind of a part 2 from last week, where we started doing participant observation. Remember, your goal last week was just to kind of start doing it, start to meet people, start to do events. Participant observation is hard, especially if you haven't done it much before. So if you feel like it didn't work out, or if you like, oh, I botched it, oh, I'm never going to recover, right? It's fine. That's why we do it early in the semester. There's plenty of time for you to get participant observation events, and it's a learning process, right? Nobody's going to be perfect the first time, and it's like any kind of exercise or any kind of practice type thing. Nobody's naturally good at this. Some people are more gregarious or more outgoing or better at writing what they see than other people, but anybody can learn. And that's kind of the point of this class, right? Yeah, so last time we kind of ended on this discussion of different kinds of field notes. This is on 389 in Bernard, if you have the book or you're following along. And I gave you some examples. We went over the log. What's a log all about? Those of you in class, you have an example right in front of you, so you can tell me.
What did you do?
Yeah, what did you do at a glance, right? Like, if I'm going back through my field notes and I'm looking for what day I visited Andrea Pop, I don't want to have to like read through, every day with 1,500 words of narrative. Like, oh, it was sunny today, and then it was very hot, and I sat in my hammock, and then I don't care, right? A log at the top would be like, went to the farm today, visited Andrea Pop, paid my water bill, or something like that, right? So it's just kind of easily indexable. Especially at a glance, if you're trying to figure out, especially if you're trying to place something, right? Like, what was that day I met with Barry Palacio, the head of Ministry of Agriculture in Southern Belize? Well, I don't want to I could search for his name, but an easier way, especially this is, pre word processors, is just to kind of have a log that tells you what you were doing. Again, I also did it for expenses. Part of this was like keeping track of my budget. I spent $37 on bus tickets this week, or I spent, I went to the beach to take a day off, and I spent $50 to stay in a cabana, right? It helps keep track of your money, but also it lets you know for like next time or for when you bring students how much things cost, so you don't just have to like eyeball it the whole time. So that's a log, right? This can be who you visited. It could be what you did. It could be any kind of like major event for the house fire, right? I went to church. I went to the store. I talked to these people. The next one is jottings. What was jottings all about? Do you need another one, Jose? I got more. Or jottings. And how are they maybe a little different? They're both pretty short, as you can see. They're both kind of just lines of.
Like a to-do list or treats.
Yeah, it's to do, or it's like I think it's a remembery list, right? Like a lot of times it's details that while later I might be able to conjure up a narrative description of going to somebody's house or going to somebody's farm or something like that. I might not remember a particular phrase that somebody said or a specific detail, like how much, for my case, what year did you plant chocolate, right? It's much more useful for us as researchers to have that exact data, right? Old Man Pop planted 2,000 cacao trees in 1989 is much better data than, oh, back in the day, Old Man Pop planted a bunch of trees, right? It's the same thing, but you know, when you're actually, again, we talked about aggregation later. You can always, in your narrative of your thesis or whatever, right? Yeah, old man Pot planted a bunch of chocolate a long time ago. But if you need that data, it's not going to be there. So anything that's like a to-do list, if it's to you know, phrases or data that you want to remind yourself, a lot of the actual like number quantitative data in my field notes came from jottings. I would just kind of keep running list of how much things cost, right? What's the price of beans this week, or you know, how many people are on the bus today? Just kind of things like that to jog my memory. The third of these we talked about. Which one did we do next? Oh, descriptive field notes. This is your bread and butter. This is the kind of last one that you can, or second to last one, on the bottom of page 2, right? This is where, if you've done any kind of like, when I was an undergrad, I did creative nonfiction. That was my minor, which is kind of a cool minor. We don't think we have that here. I think we do have creative writing though, but you can kind of see how that would be useful for when you're trying to create kind of these narratives, right? And a lot of this is helping you remember when you go back to write your stuff up. But you would be surprised. There's a surprising amount of my dissertation and now my book, which is taken from very cleaned up versions of descriptive field notes, right? Like I have a lot of every chapter in my book, you know, it's like 10,000 words, 20 pages or so, has the first like 2,000 words or so, or 1,500 words is like a little story, a narrative story, which kind of like sets the tone, and then you can unpack it throughout the course of the chapter. It's a nice way to, at least for me, to write it. But a lot of those vignettes and those stories are taken from like cleaned up versions of my descriptive field notes, right? My descriptions of going over the hill to see the old man who lives in Santa Cruz, who knows the story of cacao, or the story of going to the cacao farm into the wild cacao with Mr. Sub, or the story of carbon gold in there when they put the giant ovens in San Jose to make biochar, right? All those kind of like narrative things are going to be really useful because they're evocative. They help your reader kind of engage in like a story-like atmosphere. And it makes it not just kind of dry facts. They're also good because you can fit a lot of information in there in kind of a small space, right? And this is the part where you would have like the sights, the smells, the taste, all that kind of like, you know, very evocative stuff. So on Friday, we're going to meet over at the bagel shop, and we're going to be doing different kinds of field notes. And so I'll have you do kind of like observation-y stuff, you know, counting. One time we'll do like observe this, but then another time we'll do more descriptive stuff, like what are the sights and the smells and the sounds of the bagel shop, right? And that's kind of what we're going for in here. We're gonna those are kind of the ones that we've talked about already. There are 3 other kinds that we should discuss. There we go. The next of these is a diary. Diary. Does anybody keep a diary, like in your real life diary? Or when you were like a little kid, did you have like a Dear Diary, little lock on it or something like that? Something like that. Right. Well, you at least know what diaries are. What is a diary? Like if someone just said, I write in my diary every day. Yeah, it's like your inner thoughts and feelings and stuff like that, right? Your personal feelings. Um, when you do field work, some people like to keep their diary and their descriptive stuff different. Like, you know, the classic case is Malinowski. He had very scientific, he wanted to keep his field notes very scientific. So all his like personal thoughts were in a separate diary, right, which wasn't published till after he died, and caused controversy and reinterpretation, right, as people got to see kind of the full story of what was going on in that place. Other people like myself, I have a hard time juggling lots of documents. So while Bernard and Malinowski would say, keep your log and your diary and your field notes separate, I have them all kind of in one running document. There are pros and cons to both, right? What do you think are maybe the pros of keeping it together? We've kind of talked about what Malinowski says, keep it separate, but why might you want to keep it all together or build it in together?
Most likely some information.
What was that?
Most likely there's a.
Yeah, less likely to lose information. What else? Yeah, right. Like I kind of started keeping it separately. I like literally did the Bernard thing with my first master's. I had four notebooks, like four of those composition books. One was diary, one was log. By the end, I was putting it all together because uh I think, at least for me, right, as like doing ethnography is very subjective. It's very personal. Your personality is like tied up into it. So it didn't make sense for me to like write a very technical depiction of what was going on and have this very like personal, emotive one, right? I put it all together because like how I felt about somebody and this interaction we had, right? Maybe I want to make sure that it's in there because that I could think, well, like those texts, they're kind of jackasses, right? Like I don't really like them. And so when I write about it, like I want to make sure that like, that's in there. So I'm not just like looking at this data. I can kind of think of it in a broader context. Yeah.
Personal biases too.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, so if I was like, and they said this, right? If I just had their quotes, but I was like, those texts, they're like, this is a real example. When I went there first, the techs were the ones running the guest house, at least they were in charge. And they would charge you for everything. Like they would charge you to like a quarter to charge your phone because there's no electricity. Or if you needed like there was no stove in the guest house, so they would charge you for 50 cents to boil your water or something like that. And other people weren't like that. They would just like give it to you for free, but in a community like that, nothing's really free, right? There was like trading favors or I'll help you at your chocolate farm or something, right? But and it kind of like pissed me off a lot of times. Like, why are you nickel and diming me? I would just give you money for this at the end, or I would help you out in other ways. But it helped me later because I realized these were like, like they had this like very business mentality. They had like rejected tradition and Catholic Church and rituals and had like bought into the whole business capitalism, we're going to get rich kind of thing, right? And so like having my diary about like kind of being frustrated at them. Later, I was able to go back and be like, oh, this is part of like this bigger change as people like start to monetize things in this society, right? Versus if I had kept it separate, I'm not sure if I would have like made that connection, right? Other people, again, are more wary of putting their personal thoughts in the diary. Maybe there's this fear that you're going to get famous someday and they're going to like put your field notes into. This is like my professor Grendel. He had all his fields. He had hundreds of pages of field notes in this filing cabinet that was locked with a padlock. And I was like, his grad student, and I was like, Grendel, like this is like in the early, he's dead now, so he doesn't care. In the early 2000s, I was like, let me type your field notes for you. Like, this is great. Like, I owe you 12 hours a week or whatever. Like, let me spend time like writing these up. It'll be interesting. I want to like learn about, firsthand what was going on and kind of live the day by day by reading these. And he was just like, no. And I was like, well, why? There's like good stuff in there. He was like, ah. And then like, like as I worked for him for like 3 years, the stories started to come out, like his romances with this colonial officer's wife in the Capitol, and like this drama, this like him getting threatened or like people doing witchcraft. There's all kinds of stuff in there that he was like, and eventually like he told me those stories, but he was like concerned because like he died and his wife donated all his stuff to the Florida State University, their archive library. Look, we have special collections here, but there are certain boxes or certain files that are like, do not open until certain years. It's like, don't open until 2040 or don't open until 2050. And some of it's like, oh, these are student grades in there, but like those people are all like long gone by now. But it's like the drama stuff. So some people like to have that separately, so you can like work out your thoughts. And I think this is probably more so if you're by yourself in the field. Like if my first time I was by myself for my first year pretty much, or the first 6 months. And the second time my wife was there with me for the year. And so when you have someone else, you can kind of like process your thoughts and you can like talk about like, that was a really weird experience we just had, or this is really different from what I was expecting or different from home. But if you are just by yourself, a lot of times like having a diary is a really good way to like process those thoughts and kind of figure out, there's no therapist in the village. My people don't believe in therapy, so you got to be your own kind of therapist. And I gave you kind of an example, right, from my field notes. One other, this is again, it's all kind of mixed in. One other interesting thing today, I shocked myself pretty hard because I used to play electric in the village because there's no electricity. So I built solar panel. I got solar panels and batteries and built myself a solar system. So I shocked myself, almost electrocuted myself. Went through right middle finger up my wrist, exited through the flat of my foot because I didn't shoes on. Even 8 hours later, the tip of my middle finger is still sore. My wrist hurts, presumably from the electricity induced contractions. Glad I didn't end up like Rachel, who was another grad student with me at the time, who electrocuted herself on some third world power and killed and died during her field work. So I was pretty glad about that. Yet another example of how Belize is out to get me. In the last month, I've been run over by a boat propeller, and I was almost run over by a truck as well during that time. Before we just had this, again, about the solar, we just had two panels on top. We ran off 12 volt DC, but this time we have semi-centralized trailer. So the container truck, they'd switched from DC individual solar to AC in the village, right? So it just shows you that Edison was right when he electrocuted that elephant to show how dangerous Tesla's AC power was, right? So it is interesting and it lets me know what was going on that day and my feelings. It's not necessarily like something that's going to go in my book, right? I'm not going to like, there are like ethnographic kind of memoir things where you'd write about like the time I got ran over by a boat and got my leg chopped up, or the time a truck rolled down a hill and almost ran me over and I jumped up in the back of the truck, right? But those aren't going to be in your main field. But it is still really interesting, and it does really take you back and help kind of put you in that place and think about, while it is, oh, that's like an interesting little thing that you wrote about. Isn't it crazy that you almost got killed 3 times in a month in Blaze? It does have good data in it, right? It talks about how we used to be on the first time we were there, we had DC, like on your car kind of battery power. And then the village had switched to, a centralized AC kind of power or alternating current. They put these inverters that they would transmit AC energy. So it does tell you a little bit about kind of the big changes going on, but it's focused not on the data, but focused on your experience through that. There's two more kinds of field notes, which we can talk about. Methodological, that's the last one. What do you think that's all about? Techniques for collecting data. What kind of stuff might you write about in methodological, right? Instead of focusing on what's happening descriptively, writing about your methods as you're in the field. What kind of stuff might you write about? What's something methodological you wrote about, Jose?
So one thing I did, funny from my interviews. So when I first started doing interviews, I was kind of too like, why it? So therefore, my method was, I was like, need to speak more. And then I figured out one time when I was doing a recording, this guy turned off my recording and then started telling me what I asked. So my next time I put on my notes, take quicker notes, or take little notes here and there.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing like that will help you, especially in the beginning. In the beginning, you're just going out there.
Mm-hmm.
It goes like, okay, let's do this. So usually I would do it to kind of help better my research.
Mm-hmm.
Put in a question during like an interview. This person brought this up, but then I brought it up later.
Or fix a question.
That was like, oh, like that colleague took away my beer. And then I take, whoa, the colleague took away your beer or took away your cattle.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So then you ask this question that will need obviously more information, which I use a lot of. Witchcraft is a big thing. Like, I didn't think about witchcraft until somebody like, oh yeah, they go put a curse on me. And then that started about witchcraft and it became a whole section.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Or if you ask a question a certain way and it doesn't work, like, do you ever make offerings to the spirits? And people are like, no. And they're like, do you ever leave tobacco for the Cha'il? Oh, yes. Well, like, it's the same question. It's the same thing, but like, why? Well, because it was this way it was phrased, right? Bernard has this funny, and this is actually like, I think a pretty common experience. Oftentimes people aren't sure who you are. They think you're a missionary. They think you're CIA or something. So Bernard has this note in his field notes of like, make sure to drink beer in front of people and smoke cigarettes because missionaries don't do that. Right? It sets you apart. And I had the same one, right? Like you could, people would identify you as Baptist or Catholic based on if you were drinking a beer, right? And that's not like go get drunk in the field, but like accept a beer if someone's giving it to you. Because if not, even if like there's a lot of times I just didn't drink in the community because drunk people in my community, my people don't like show their feelings until they're drunk. And then when they are, they like show you all their feelings. And usually that involves like either crying or violence. So I didn't want to like hang out with drunk people at the bar because it usually ends up with someone getting machete chopped or something. But you know, like if somebody gives you a beer, you have to accept it because if not, they're going to like put you in that category of Baptist, right? Which might be great for your research, but it's going to put you in certain kind of groups versus like in our community, you know, here you're like, oh, whether you drink or not, like it's just a personal choice. There, it's kind of like a social marker. I have this funny one in here. Do y'all know the game Carcassonne? Like a board game. You're not that nerdy. Carcassonne. We brought board games. There's one of the kids who's now, he was 3 when we started doing field. He's now in college. He was like a nerd in a Maya community, which is kind of funny. Like there are no nerds. He was like, I don't like to go to the farm. I like air conditioning. Like he wants to get like a business job and work in the city. He liked to play games, especially when he was younger, and they didn't like make him go to farm as much. But there's no like game shops, you know, like in Belize. So we would like bring him, you know, Euro games and stuff like this. Is Carcassonne. It's one of the games that we brought. We used to bring games down there and teach them to the kids, you know. And it started from like Go Fish and worked up to like more complicated games. Here basically is you're building, you're putting tiles down with roads. There are and you put down things that have villages, some things that have like churches, some things that have, you know, farms and stuff like that. It's very relatable to them as a villager, right? Because it's based on like 16th century France, which in many ways, a village in Belize is kind of close to, right? There's no electricity. People are walking to farm. There's churches everywhere, right? So as a funny note, this is a methodological note. We taught the kids Carcassonne. It's a big hit. It's secretly a learning tool because it teaches you spatial reasoning. It teaches you math. You have to like count dice and stuff like that. It's a fun learning style, better than like the yelling that's used by the primary school teachers in the village, right? But interestingly, even though it's like a fun game, it turned out to be a really good ethnographic tool. One of the things that was interesting was how they all, both children's and adults who we taught how to play this game, got how much fun they got out of placing multiple churches or abbeys, which is this kind of center square right in the middle of the board. The one with no dots on it, there's like a church tile. So they like to play the church tile, and they would comment on it every time. As good Catholics, whenever the first church was placed and was surrounded and scored, they would declare it the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was the first church in that community before they had Protestants. When one was placed with no people nearby, no little meeple things, they would declare it the annoying Nazarenes because they didn't like the Nazarenes because they live. The Nazarene Church was just up the hill from us, and they had really loud music, so loud that even though it was like from here to Anthropology Building, it was so loud that it would shake the pots off of the walls in our house and knock everything off the shelves. So we always are annoyed by them, and it was super hot because there's no windows. So in the summer, it's this metal roof, concrete block house where basically it was really hot. So nobody liked to go there. So yeah, if you put a church and there were no like little figurines nearby, they'd be like, oh, that's the annoying Nazarenes. They don't like to go there. If you put one at the far end of the board, they would call it the Mennonites or Jehovah's because their churches were all the way on the edge of town. In this way, the family was mapping the village geography onto the evolving game. Just as there was once a single central church, then later in the game, over time, there had been a proliferation of churches. So this game, which we just taught because it would be fun to teach the kids how to play a game, and I wanted to play games with someone and there was no one around, became a kind of a working tool in the community or for like mapping people's preferences or ideas about religion through this. It was a really weird kind of thing to come out of it and not something I would have expected at all. I didn't like pack up a board game to Belize and be like, now I'm going to like use this as a research tool. But it is really interesting. And I wrote about it methodologically, you know, as a way to like beyond just like asking people questions about like what do you think about the Nazarenes? What do you think about the Jehovah's? What do you think about the Mennonite church? The game itself kind of gave people a mechanism or a simulation to tell their own stories about these topics without having kind of this like very artificial interview kind of format. The last kind of field notes are analytic field notes, and these are often kind of high level stuff. You don't write them very often. But when you do, they're usually gold, right? Where are they? Boop, boop, boop. There. A lot of these things are going to be like the high level thoughts that you have about something. So while, every day you might be like, I went to the farm, I talked to this person, they told me how much chocolate they had. I went to this thing, I went to church today, they did this. Occasionally, like you'll be writing something in your field notes and you'll be like, you'll have some kind of bigger thought about like how these things all fit together, right? And these are what your analytic field notes. So for example, I have a section in there where usually these were like rainy day field notes or rainy morning or really hot mornings where I didn't want to like leave the front porch and I would like write stuff, kind of reflecting on what was going on currently, right? So here's a couple examples, right? So when I was there, the first time there was only one chocolate company. The second time there were two chocolate companies. They were competing against each other, right? So I had written about lots of encounters talking to farmers, and I would be like, which chocolate company do you sell to now? Because you all used to sell the same one, and now like so half of you are selling to one and half of you are selling the other. Why did you do this, right? So eventually, I started like seeing patterns, and I wrote about this in these analytic field notes, right? The division between Moho and TCGA in my community is an expression of countless small slights and grievances over the years that can now be expressed in totemic differences between two organizations that both buy the exact same product for the exact same price. Like, why pick one? Well, because we're not them, right? It became this way of separating out like our family buys from this company or we sell to this company and your family sells to this one. But this totemic difference isn't really stable, but only appears in the synchronic historic moment of the present, since there's not enough chocolate in Southern Belize to sustain two companies long term. They were fighting it out. And it's just like how, in many ways, it reminded me of like kind of the national parties and how people associate with them. More about like not being your neighbor or setting yourself apart from other people in the community than actual like policy. I like this policy versus that policy, right? And so again, it's kind of you see as an example of like I talked to tons of people over a month, and then I had this, this is kind of a synthesis of what was going on. Here's another one. So I did a lot of labor exchanges with people, and I go, help build houses or help farm or something like that. And after a while, I started to realize that this was also changing, right? Before, my labor exchanges were based on the equivalency of days. You work one day for me, I owe you one day, right? And of course, you have to both eat a meal afterwards to like seal the deal. But now there's been a change towards calculating labor exchange in terms of quarts planted, right? So not all farms are the same size. So if you plant 2 quarts for me, 2 quarts of corn for me in one day, but my farm is smaller and you only plant 1 quart, you'd still end up owing me a different quart on a different day. It's an important distinction. Apparently, my neighbor Thomas says the quart has changed over time as well. So that back in the day, they used to use a gourd-shaped scoop, fat and round on the bottom, more cylindrical on top, but now it's switched to a tin can. But the measurement is not exactly the same, giving rise to local rather than universal definitions of what a quart is as the basis of not labor exchange and reckoning planting. Similarly, weight is based in corns and beans is based in a dish now. They know that it holds 2 pounds of corn or whatever, and they figure weight based on the number of scoops. Though in other villages like in Halakte, they use balance scales for weighing. Right, so these are not description of what happened in a particular day, but kind of synthesis of some of these big differences. Similarly, another one, unlike in Guatemala where people plant in triangles, plant in rows, here people plant in triangles. While Sustainable Harvest and NGO try to tell farmers here it's more efficient to plant in straight rows because you will get more yields per acre. In practice, this would only be true on an ideal flat square piece, which does not apply to the hilly, irregular, rocky ground of San Jose. Another example of how universal solutions often don't make as much sense when you spend a little time in local conditions, right? Which is usually what's missing from most of these big development schemes, right? So I'd been to a bunch of plantings, I'd been to a bunch of development meetings, and I had seen this kind of disconnect, but but I got to the point where I was able to write it up in kind of this succinct little thing. And you'll start to do this, right? It usually won't happen on your first couple of field notes, but after you've done it a couple times, you'll start to see how it all fits together in big picture. Again, you don't write very many of these, but the stuff that you do write usually is good, right? And with a little bit of polishing, a lot of this kind of stuff went into my dissertation. Like I have a thing on, I went to so many meals, right? Because I would always eat at people's houses because I really like to cook in there. But I started to like see that there was a pattern, right? If you go at this time of day, you're going to get a drink and a snack, and if you go at this time of day, you're going to get a full meal. And this time of day, you'll get vegetables and this time of day you'll get this, right? And so I was able to like eventually come up with a scheme. Like if you remember in theory class, Mary Douglas's kind of grammar of a meal, right? So if you go at a wedding, you're going to have meat plus vegetable plus prestige beverage plus dessert. If you go for breakfast, it's only going to be eggs or beans and tortillas plus hot beverage, right? And so I was able to kind of sort out how, you know, the grammar or the underlying pattern of eating in that community. And then when I had my chapter on Maya culinary traditions, I was able to put that, you know, with very minimal modification, just kind of cleaning up some of my side thoughts, goes straight into the book, into the dissertation. And like as I'm reviewing my book now, listening into on audio, and it's really interesting. Sometimes I'll hit these like different parts that are like, I'll remember this is straight from a field note. It's either descriptive, like me going into the wild cacao for the first time, what it feels like, or these kind of analytical asides, which I wrote about, which are, you know, taken whole cloth and put into the book. So do you have a good feel about what types, what the differences are between those kinds of field notes? Do you feel like if we went to the bagel shop on Friday and I had an activity that was like, now we're going to write descriptive field notes, that you'd be able to do it. And then the next 10 minutes later, I was like, and now we're going to write methodological field notes about how we might, you know, better collect data at the bagel shop. Do you think you'd be able to know the difference? Now we're going to write a diary entry about what I feel at the bagel shop. Well, if you don't, review these and we'll do it on Friday. Okay. So those are generating field notes. We have 15 minutes or so left. The rest of these are going to be about what we do with our field notes. And we're going to actually do this a lot more towards the end of the class. We're going to have a whole week on coding, and I'll bring in some I'll show you some software which, you know, you can use to code. It's not, well, for this project, it's not going to be super important to use like a, you know, a database management system. Like I said, I have like 750,000 words of text in my field notes, and it's, you know, 700 separate entries, 700 day entries, I think is 65. Oh, it's more than that. 750 probably, 800 probably by now. It's a lot, and it's a lot for me to manage. For this project, you're not going to have that much, right? You're going to have a couple interviews, you're going to have a couple field note type entries. And so you'll be able to manage it like in a Word document or documents. But as it gets bigger, it's going to be super hard to like manage it. So there are a number of different techniques. Like I said, we're going to talk more about this later in the semester. It's super important when you do your field notes to at least put the date on top, right? So you can sort them by date. And again, maybe to have those little log activities. So if you went to, you know, here's my field note entry about like when I went to the performance of the La Llorona festival in Albuquerque or something, right? I might have the date, October 31st, log at the very top, you know, visit or a La Llorona festival in Albuquerque, right? And then I might have my description, right? That's kind of a really basic way of just having that information, but we can do so much more than that. We can also do what's called coding. George Peter Murdoch was really the first. He was an anthropologist back in the 50s. Codes. Nope. Do you all know what the HRAF is? It was one of those resources that we have in the library. I had it on the database. Oh. EHRAF. So George Peter Murdoch was one of these like early 20th century, early mid 20th century anthropologists, and you know, he kind of coming out of that Boasian, at least trained in the Boasian tradition, and realized that there was just a lot of information that wasn't that the early Boasians were doing a really good job of collecting data, but they were doing just a terrible job of making it accessible, right? It was what often got called intellectual butterfly collecting. Boaz would go out and just collect everything. Tell me your rituals, people. Tell me your blueberry pie recipes. Tell me about what that mask means. And we'll write it all down. But people are still going through the Boaz files. There's just so much stuff, and there's so much good stuff in there that's not properly organized, or at least wasn't at the time. Murdoch said that it's much better for us to organize this, right? It's really important to organize it because if not, then how are we going to be able to do ethnological comparisons? What is an ethnology? What's the difference between ethnography and ethnology? Anybody? Bueller? Ethnography is, this is a class called ethnographic methods. Hopefully we doing okay on that one. Ethnography, study of one what? Yeah, one culture at one particular place or time. Ethnology is, yeah, compare and contrast, right? It can be at one particular time. I'm going to study all the chocolate farmers and communities around the world today, Belize, Papua New Guinea, Nigeria, wherever, and I'm going to compare and contrast. I could also compare and contrast over time, right? I can look at what was chocolate farming like in Belize in the 30s, what was it like in the 50s, what was it like in the 70s, and I have a whole chapter that's basically like the history of chocolate farming in Belize from 800 AD to today. Something we can do by comparing these different sources. One of the problems with doing that, though, is that books are often not organized the same way, right? It would be super easy if there was a thesis template like you get in grad school. There was like, all right, chapter number 2 is your methods file. Chapter number 3 is the social organization. Chapter number 4 is making a living. Chapter number 5 is gender relations, right? And we could do something like that. And oftentimes for your thesis, it's just way easier to have those categories. But they're not. And especially, researchers who have been in the field a long time often will organize them differently, or they'll have a book on a specific subject and they're not just general ethnographies. So the question is, how do you compare and contrast specific things, right? Especially if you just have a whole pile of books, and this is the days before Google Scholar or something where you could just type in Maya Cacao, right, or something like that. Murdoch said that we can actually code these, and so went through basically all the ethnographies that were relevant at the time and applied codes to them, right? So basically, just kind of in the margins. So if this was your ethnography of Wacudal society or whatever, just like kind of over here in the margins, they would put a code number. And you can this is an example of some of those codes, right? Like, so usually the broad category is on like the tens, or the biggest categories are on the hundreds, the middle categories on the tens, and then specific things are on the single digits, right? So if I had a chapter on agriculture, I might code that whole chapter as 240 agriculture. But if it's talking about arboriculture, like tree crops, I might mark that as 245, textiles 248, agricultural science 242, right? Similarly, like if I was writing about clothing, I would, clothing 290, but it's, special garments for holidays 292, right? Again, this is primarily in the days before you could easily search something, but it allows you to take these kind of disparate sources and meld them together and say, I'm only looking at, the leather industry and societies around the world. I know to go to the EHRAF, this thing right here, and I can pull ethnographic sources with this 282 code, right? I just want sources to talk about leather, and I can further refine that by geographic area. So I only want leather working sources in Mesoamerica, right? And again, that's way easier than having to sift through all those books yourself. You might be like, so what? I'm not writing an ethnology. But in many ways, what we're doing when you write up your paper really depends on coding as well, right? Because you are doing basically your own analysis of your field work, right? And it's really interesting, especially the more time that goes by, between when you write your field notes and when you write your thesis or your dissertation or your book or whatever, your paper that comes out of it. Oftentimes it's like almost a different person wrote it, right? So it's almost like reading somebody else's stuff. And you're often kind of like surprised about what you wrote a lot of times. And so having this kind of coding makes it really easy. I'm going to show you a program that I like to use later on the semester called Atlas, in which I can, I went through and coded all my field notes with different topics, and it's really good because it doesn't have to be like this paragraph is this and this paragraph is, you can have overlapping. You basically just highlight sections of text and click what topics you want, right? So this whole section's about chocolate, but this particular section's about the history of cacao farming. This particular section's about religion and chocolate farming. This section's about economics and chocolate farming. And then I can just click a button or two on the interface and say, spit out a Word document with all the times I talked about religion and chocolate, right? It's super easy to write a section or a chapter or a paper on religion and chocolate when it spits out all the references for you or all the times you wrote about it, versus trying to like just sift through things and be like, where did I see that again? You can also use different codes. You don't have to use the Murdoch codes. A lot of those, you might be like, oh, that's not really particular to my case, right? Or I am focused on a particular topic, right? I'm focused on ghost hunters. There's only like one code for that in the HRAF, so everything's going to be the same code. So I'm going to use codes that are more relevant to me. And one way to do this is there's two ways. Either to come up with your codes beforehand, right? So I kind of knew some of the big topics that I was looking for, right? Cacao economics, cacao and religion, cacao and family, cacao and gender. And as I kind of went, I was kind of looking for those things and I was tagging them. Other times you can use what's called generative coding, right? What comes out of the text as you read it. This can either be like you reading something and being like, wow, it's like a lot of stuff about like women owning cacao. Maybe I'll start a new code for that. Or you can use what's called in vivo coding. Well, again, we'll talk about this later, spend more time on it later in the semester, and basically have a computer program tell you what the big terms are, right? So the term cacao, the terms cacao and religion appear closely together in these parts of the document, right? 17 times or 50 times or something like that. And it tells you that it might be something useful. We don't have a ton of time versus left to talk about this, but really when you do coding and as you start to kind of go through your field notes, probably the easiest thing for you to do at this point is just kind of use the comment function in Word. You know what that is? This one right here, new comment. And then just kind of go through here and mark things. Like I'm just going to highlight that and put, go away. Actually, I'll just do it on my actual field notes instead of syllabus. So again, here's here's our field note example. So I might just go through and talk about, I might just tag this as, what should I tag it as? This is the diary about electrocuting myself. What's like a big topic here? You don't want to be super specific, like time I almost electrocuted myself. Sadly, or luckily, I would only have one code for that because I only electrocuted myself once. Yeah, or maybe just electricity, right? Electricity, because I probably have lots of things. I was super into solar at the time because I was building solar systems for people. So I was super into electricity. So I had lots of things that I talked about electricity. I might be like electricity, right? And again, this is not going to this isn't the complicated version where you can have it spit out everything together, but it's way easier to just kind of like roll down the side of your field notes and you're like, yeah, that paragraph's about electricity, or this one is about, totemic business or something like that. So business. All right. Again, it just kind of like summarizes what the paragraph is about. So that way, when you're going back through your stuff, it's easier to like find stuff. Because even if you're only doing 5 or 6 participant observations and a couple interviews, you're still going to be like, where is that one? Then you don't have to like read through the whole thing again. So we're going to get that far. Again, you don't have a ton right now, so it's not super useful, but it is good to start doing this as you start doing your field notes. And then at the last week, before, after we've done our different methods, before we do our presentations, we'll look at I'll have you put all your stuff together, all your field notes, all your interviews, all your pile sorts and your questionnaires and things. And then we'll kind of start looking for how you might index that in a bigger kind of way. So just a little sneak preview. Okay, that's it for today. That's all the time we have. We're going to meet on Friday. For those of you in class, we'll meet in the Einstein's Bagel Shop. I'll put a note on the door, but don't come here because it'll just take longer for me to collect all of you and then bring you. But the sign will be on the door. It tells you if you do forget, I put an announcement on Canvas to remind you as well. And come with like paper and pencil or a laptop or just something to write with, however you choose to do that. Cool. That's it for today. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.